So the goal in this video is to discuss the concept of what's called cheiros, also translated into English as freedom. And the concept of freedom in this particular setting will be associated with the holiday that we're about to experience, which is the holiday of Pesach, Passover. And the idea here, what I want to sort of show is to try to define exactly what we mean when we say freedom. Because sometimes, just especially in the world today, there's all kinds of associations we have in our minds with the idea of freedom, the concept of freedom, and whether it has to do with slavery or oppression. These are sort of like very popular themes in the world right now. And I think that there's a certain set of mechanics that apply to the concept of freedom and sort of how it always works. Freedom has a certain set of universally consistent patterns to it. And then there's lots of different settings that people find themselves in where they have to try to access freedom and become free. And so I want to sort of illustrate that's really what the Torah's framework is when it describes what freedom is. So it's designed to convey these principles or mechanics or patterns so that way you can sort of apply freedom in every different setting. And the reason why that's important is because you might think that, well, freedom is only relevant when you're, enslaved or imprisoned, but actually being imprisoned is much more complex and actually much more prevalent than you might imagine. We can become imprisoned in many different ways, and that's, the obvious examples are imprisoned in a jail cell, but actually the concept of Mitzrayim, if you take a look at the actual word of Mitzrayim, it's spelled like this, and this word Mitzrayim, so it comes from the word Mitzrayim. And Mitzrayim, the word Mitzar, means a narrow place, some kind of confinement. That's what the concept of prison is in the Torah, some kind of confinement. And so I want to sort of show you what Pesach is supposed to do, the holiday of Passover. How is it supposed to give you access to real cheiros, to real freedom, in a way that is not just sort of getting out of one particular confinement and then getting into another one. The reason why I'm mentioning that is because the Ramban, Nachmanides, in his introduction to the book of Exodus, Sefer Shmos, so he describes that there's really two phases to the freedom that Bnei Israel actually are trying to achieve in the story of leaving Egypt. There are two different stages of freedom. The first one is the obvious one. That's really what we tend to talk more about because it seems like it's so outlandish and miraculous that we were slaves in a particular country, a particular economy, and then we were freed from that in a miraculous way, and God literally took us out with all kinds of wild miracles to save us from that enslavement and that oppression. But then the next phase of that process of freedom was actually what he calls a spiritual freedom, and it's some kind of qualitatively, different and yet the same in that they had to sort of escape from a confinement that was more than just being trapped in a particular country or particular setting of slavery. And the Ramban describes in his writing there in the introduction to Sefer Shmos that the concept here of freedom is referring to the giving of the Torah and access to the information in the Torah. Not just that there's some kind of religious experience of, oh, God gave us a Torah, a book of laws or something, but actually this is a framework of how to achieve and access freedom from confinement in all its forms. That was the point of the second half of the book of Exodus, was sort of learning about the set of tools that we were given to actually exit from any form of confinement. So in order to understand that, we have to sort of take a look at the ways that confinements are formed in their various contexts. There's lots of different ways, so let's take a look at that. So what I drew here is a diagram that I like to use to convey the mechanics and the structure of sort of how we are designed. And there's a few different parts of these mechanics. When you get an idea of how the mechanics actually work, so then what it can do for you is give you a way of almost harnessing or managing the different aspects of this. Now, it looks very simple, and I want to just sort of walk you through what it is. You just see a stick figure, and then we have this weird cloud up here where it says the word you. And this weird cloud up here where it says the word you is supposed to represent you, the neshama, you, the consciousness. And the word neshama is usually used to mean soul, and what it really means is the self, the you that is looking out through your eyes, and that essentially is the real identity of you. Now, the tricky thing about you, the neshama and the self here, is that there is no way to really describe this part of you. This is the you that is completely intangible. When we talk about, loving someone for who they are, so we're referencing this. This is the part that makes you you and not me. It makes you unique. It's the real you. But the crazy part about the real you is that there is no way to define it. There's no way to measure it. There's no way to really see it or describe it. And so what's so fascinating about that is that it's the part that makes you the most you. It really is the essence of you, and yet it is also simultaneously the most indescribable. Now, then there's these other elements. So we have this stick figure body over here, and then we have this little channel area here. And the stick figure body represents sort of the set of tools that you use to interact with existence. And there's lots of different aspects and facets to the set of tools, and that's also represented by sort of this area. It's like sort of the bridge that connects you to the set of tools. Now, the significance here is that you actually have this weird superpower. Or maybe it's a weird ability that the Torah describes in the very beginning of the Torah in Parshas Bereshis. Describes how you have this ability to now hyper-identify yourself instead of actually recognizing that you are this endless, immeasurable self, this consciousness, this neshama thing that you are, the essence of you. You actually have the ability to accidentally move your sense of self, your point of identity, from here to various aspects of the set of tools. So for example, let's say that you have a very good sense of humor. So then you might move your sense of self from here down to, let's just, we'll make a little smiley face. That represents your sense of humor. And now you identify yourself as, oh, I'm the funny one. I'm a funny person. Or you might have a very pretty body, very attractive. Could be sexually attractive, could be aesthetically attractive. And either way, you might identify yourself with that. So we can draw a circle around the structure of your body, and you can say, oh, I'm the pretty one. I'm a pretty person. And you have some sense of yourself as identifying as that. You also might identify yourself with some kind of aspect of your sexuality. You can say, oh, I am sexually this thing. That's my identity. I have a sexual identity. And you associate yourself as being that type of person sexually. And so you can actually get senses of self and derived from various facets of this body. If you're a very emotionally tempestuous person, so then you might actually associate yourself with your feelings. I'm very emotionally sensitive, I'm very emotionally charged, and you can get a sense of yourself as if that's you. And sometimes you get so deeply embedded in these types of aspects of yourself, then you can actually stop really remembering that you're more than them. And when that happens, then things start getting a little bit difficult inside. You'll start to experience a severe type of dissonance because you'll sense, well, on the one hand, I feel like I am someone special. Everyone, all of us intuit that we are irreplaceable. That stems from this, because this is the truly unique you that you are. There is no other you like this. But there is a lot of other yous like this. In other words, if you think that you're pretty or funny or sexually attractive or emotionally sensitive or whatever, any of these other qualities, well, there's always other people that have those qualities. So when you start to identify yourself as any of these things, it will be a big letdown psychologically and emotionally for you, because you'll see yourself as something which is very limited and finite and start to feel actually unhappy with yourself in that type of situation. And so at the same time, you might not know how to get out of that, because if you're not aware of this aspect of your being, then you might get so bogged down in this or this or this or this or this. You might get so bogged down in that you actually will have a hard time even seeing that there's another way. And you just sort of get so used to, so habituated to perceiving and thinking about yourself in that way that to leave that behind is going to be very difficult. And that is a form of confinement. You know, it's interesting because when you think about being a prisoner, so being a prisoner in a jail, you could actually be, this is a fascinating example of a guy named Viktor Frankl, who basically figured this out during the Holocaust. He was trapped in various horrific confines, and he had an observation. He wrote a whole book about this, essentially articulating that he discovered that once he learned this, that he was none of these things, then the Germans had no way to really harm him, because his body was not him, and they were trying to degrade him. How are they trying to degrade him? They were trying to say to him, you're nothing, you're meaningless, you're replaceable, we can kill you at our whims, at will, and we can completely devalue your being. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to convince him that he is these erasable, replaceable, destroyable aspects, and then essentially they're breaking his spirit, because he senses that he's someone irreplaceable and unique and special. But they're saying, no, you're something that could be destroyed, and you're meaningless. And that's what they were trying to say to all of the Jewish people that they were murdering during that time period, was that they are essentially nothing, and that they can just be erased and it won't even matter. And so the question is, well, are you going to agree with that? When you are in that setting, what Viktor Frankl essentially articulates is that you can choose to disagree. You can say, I don't see it that way. You can, no matter how many times you beat me, you murder my loved ones, you take everything from me, I will still never perceive myself as any of these things. I am beyond all of them. I'm not my gender. I'm not my intelligence. I'm not my sense of humor. I'm not my physical appearance. I'm not my sexual attractiveness. I'm none of those things. I am this immutable, endless, unlimited self that is translated through these tools into something which others can experience in the world. But I myself, irreplaceable and endless in every way, utterly unique. And that was his, essentially his salvation during that time period. That's how he survived, was by staying attached to this truth and not letting himself get pulled into any of these habituated perspectives of himself as any of these lower aspects of his set of tools. So let's think about that a little more broadly. That means that you can be in a prison cell, you're in confinement, and yet you can still be free. That's essentially what he said. He said that he had more liberty, he had more freedom, even though the Nazis were technically they had more options, more choices of what they could do. They could move from place to place, and he could only stay in his confined areas, but he had more freedom in a sense because he was not frozen and trapped in a particular confinement in terms of his sense of his own existence. And that's a very profound realization, because confinement comes in many forms. You can be confined in a particular relationship, in a particular financial situation, in a particular pattern of thought. You could be very depressed and have lots of negative thoughts about yourself. You could be very, very certain that you are a certain way in terms of your success capacity, your potential. And you can basically pick up perspectives of yourself from here and from the world around you and get ideas about yourself that start to get more and more embedded, and they create confinement in terms of your sense of self. And then you also have the ability, if you can access this perspective, you can actually learn to rise above all these tools, all these aspects and facets, and access the endlessness that you are. Now imagine if you could do that, right? You could climb out of a particular confinement. You had a particular headspace by yourself. Oh, I'm so bad at public speaking, or I'm terrible at staying patient in a relationship, or I keep getting in fights with my children because I'm so judgmental and I can't stop myself from doing that. And so imagine if you could actually press pause on these habits, these circuits that you're constantly circling, and you could actually pull yourself out of them and access the larger you and free yourself from the confinement and sort of be in a free place, a free space for a little while to sort of like re-experience yourself as not that moment where you were not being your best self, as not that situation where you were in pain or where you were acting in a way that was ineffective or destructive, but that you're actually endlessly beyond all of that. So when you can pull out of that for a little while, take a little bit of a break from the particular patterns and sets of tools that you've been so used to using, the more you are able to access that and to climb out of this, the more you can sort of then come back in as a new person and take control of these tools, these components, from a place of greater proactivity, from greater strength. Because by being able to leave and rise above them, to spend some time out here, is what then allows you to come back from a place of greater power. And you can actually sort of, instead of seeing yourself as these things, you can see yourself as this, and then as this beyondness, and then you can look at the tools and as things that you can use at will. And you can essentially access your true will over here and then climb back in over here and then use those things on purpose when you need to. So instead of being judgmental all the time with your kids, you can choose when to judge more carefully on purpose. Instead of being constantly thinking about yourself in terms of your physical appearance, you can choose when to access that headspace because it has a place. It's important to also pay attention to your physical appearance and to your sexual attractiveness if the setting calls for that. So then you can kind of be willful in terms of sometimes accessing that self-image and other times accessing the different aspects of your set of tools that you need in different settings. So that freedom to be able to flow from here to here to here to here, back and forth, in and out, and through and to any of these aspects at will, that is true freedom. It's true freedom in terms of the Torah's map of things. And psychologically, if you think about that for only a few minutes, you'll recognize that is the definition of freedom in general. Because you can be very free and have no person enslaving you, and yet still be confined in your mind. You can still have a sense of yourself. This is my deal. I'm oppressed because of this. I'm a victim because of that. I have a hard life because of this thing outside of myself. You can have that perspective very easily, and that is a prison which you then create. And it's funny because you could live in a country and in a world where there's so much available to make your life better, as long as you can get out of that headspace, out of those confines, and see what's around you. But if you are stuck in some particular pattern of thought, some particular self-image, then it's going to be very hard to do that. And that's exactly what the Torah is. That's why in the Torah, in Parashat Ki Tisa, when we receive the Torah from Hashem, so it says that the writing on the luchos, on the tablets that Hashem gave to Moshe, they were charut al haluchot, means they were carved in and free floating on the stones. And so there was this writing that was on the stones, and it was just carved in, and essentially in a specific kind of way. And then the Medrash looks at that word and says, well, what's the meaning of that? It's that you have this expanse of stone, which is kind of like an analogy for the raw material of a person, and then you can carve into it whatever you want. And that's what essentially the Medrash then says. The meaning of that is charut, which means to carve in, is the same thing as the word cheros, which means to become free, which means you can actually take this raw material and you can go from here as the writer, and you can re-script how you want to use all these tools, and you can write in whatever you want into this. You can create the types of outcomes and thoughts and feelings and experiences that you want if you are aware that you are not these things. When you are able to tap into your beyondness and then come back into this on purpose, you can change everything. And that is literally the meaning of the concept of Pesach. The first night of Pesach is when we actually specifically focus heavily on doing this. That's the meaning of the first night of Pesach. And then the rest of the next 6 days of Pesach have their own kind of related meanings. But the idea is that that beginning, the flash at the beginning of Pesach, is to sort of reinstall the awareness that you are actually beyond all of this, and then let that explode into the tools that you use to become who you really can become, and to constantly rewrite yourself. And once you can do that, when we say that you can become anything or you can accomplish anything, that people have endless potential, that's true when you can access this. When you're trapped in here, so then you can only do whatever this is set up as. If you wrote this in a way that says you're good at this but not good at that, whatever you set yourself up as in this area, so then yeah, that's all you can do, because that's all you scripted yourself for. But if you can step out of that and access a higher headspace, and then from that place you can learn new things, you can explore new things, you can take greater control of your mind and of your body, and you can change a lot of what you are down here, then there is no end to the potential of a human being. And that's something which you all intuit. We all sense that. And when you can start to access that, it lights your life on fire. When you feel like you can't access that, then you feel like you're trapped in Mitzrayim, in the Mitzrayim, in the confinements, and then things become depressing and empty and sad. And that is why Pesach is the blast of joy, the explosion of fire and vibrant passion for life that starts the year for us again, as we now go back into this cycle of trying to access Hashem's totality that is beyond everything, to sort of bring ourselves in harmony with that, and then we can really become who we know we already are on the inside. Hope that was useful and clear, and have a Chag Sameach. Looking forward to seeing you in the next video.